One of the most iconic movies of the 21st century is The Wolf of Wall Street. It received 5 Oscar nominations, including a Best Director nomination for Martin Scorsese and a Best Actor nomination for Leonardo DiCaprio. It's also the movie that launched Margot Robbie into superstardom in her first major role playing the character of Naomi. But as well made and entertaining as the movie is, it can be easy to forget it's based on a harrowing true story. For Nadine Macaluso, The Wolf of Wall Street wasn't just a movie. It was the experience of seeing her traumatic abuse projected on theater screens for the world to see. Nadine is the real-life ex-wife of Jordan Belfort, and Margot Robbie's character of Naomi, or the Duchess of Bay Ridge as she was nicknamed, is based on her true life experiences. However, as she reveals in this interview, she had no input on the film itself or how she was portrayed. In today's conversation, I talked to Nadine about the exploitation of her trauma in books and films, her tumultuous marriage to and escape from the Wolf of Wall Street himself, Jordan Belfort, and her brand new book, Run Like Hell, that helps women trapped in abusive relationships. Here's my conversation with Nadine Macaluso. All right, Dr. Nay, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I mean, first and foremost, I want to say thank you for your book. As someone who does a show like this, I'm always looking for resources to help better understand ununderstandable situations. So it's been very helpful, and I enjoyed reading it. I'm curious, just right off the bat, you said in the beginning of your book that your intention is never to glorify abusive relationships, even though you're going to talk very openly about them. There's been a lot of critiques about a certain film that featured you as a character. And
Right.
The conversation surrounding Wolf of Wall Street, the people that love it say it just shows the situation. It doesn't glorify. Critics say it does glorify. People hang posters of, Leonardo DiCaprio all over their wall and say it motivates them. Do you think that Wolf of Wall Street glorifies a very abusive situation?
I do. As someone who lived through it, I do think that the movie does glorify it. And the movie actually makes it a farce and makes it funny. And some of it, of course, was funny, but most of it was not so funny. So I do think they glorify it, and I think they had to make it entertaining.
When I watched it, loved the movie. I'm a huge Scorsese fan, so as a film, it's entertaining. And then you read your book and you see and you describe it like the Greek tragedy on screen, and it's this award-winning film. And then you start reading the true story behind it, and you start questioning. It's the age-old conversation of what's appropriate, what's not. Do you feel any resentment or this shouldn't have been made in this way? Do you separate it as okay, that's art. This is my story. They didn't necessarily owe me any kind of, consideration there. Where do you put that? Because it's in the cultural zeitgeist, everybody has a different entry point to it, and yours is very personal.
Well, and this is where therapy really comes in handy. So I did a lot of therapy because remember, Jordan wrote a book first. So I kind of got titrated into the process through the book.
Right.
And then the movie happened. And so I had done so much therapy around it that my own personal experience was, this is clearly something that's much bigger than me. And I'm going to surrender into the process. And that was my mindset.
Did you have a hand in that process at all? Did they talk to you and ask for that?
No. No, I had no creative input. I made no money. The only thing I did do was meet Margot Robbie because they wanted to get my accent. And that's why they don't use my name, because I told them, you can't use my name. I mean, not that it really mattered. That was my own personal. Yeah, everybody connected the dots. That was my own personal stance. But no, I had no input into it at all, except for my likeness. Right.
Sure. Right. I'm curious. So you mentioned the book. Obviously, Jordan kind of exploited the trauma through writing the book. And I'm fascinated by him. I think that's the reason there's a movie. It's the reason there's so much about him. I'm just fascinated that he still loves the movie, promotes the movie, shares his story very proudly. And this may be a softball question, but how is he so proud of a biography
Yeah.
that most people would say this is the most shameful parts of my life?
Yeah, and I think that's the juxtaposition of the movie that makes it so interesting, right? Because it shows the different sides of somebody like this. But my perspective is that a person such as Jordan will exploit anyone or anyone, including himself, to get his need met for money, power, pleasure, or status. And that's part of who he is as a person.
So it really is the epitome of no bad press, like all press is.
Yeah. Yeah. He'll exploit me. He'll exploit the trauma. He'll exploit himself because, again, he wants to get his needs met for money, power, pleasure, and status.
There's the age-old question, does power corrupt, or do corrupt people seek power? Do you think that he, from the very beginning, always was looking for ways to abuse and manipulate power, or do you think it was a situation of power corrupting somebody?
I think it's probably both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's multiple causality and things like that. But I definitely think he is someone who is drawn to power and being powerful.
Do you think some people are just inherently predisposed to that? Or do you think it
Yes,
always is? Okay.
I do. I think due to their personality, because personality drives behavior. Now, it could be their personality, their innate personality combined with their environment, right? That then creates this perspective or lens through which they see the world.
Do you think there's some people for which there's no hope? Like some people are born with a personality that is inherently looking for the worst things? Or is it something where, early on, if you can identify it and catch it, you can kind of work through those things?
I wouldn't be a therapist if I didn't think people couldn't change, right? So I'm in the business of change. I do think, and I've seen people that are quite pathological change.
Okay.
I have seen that, but I think at a certain level of pathology, I think the rewards that they get are too good. The cozy comforts of being powerful and dominating, and intimidating. Why would they change?
Yeah. We may circle back on that point, but this kind of leads
Sure.
directly to one of the questions that I had early on. You said in your book, which I loved, abuse is a problem that lies entirely with the abuser. And, I think that's really relevant because a lot of people are blamed by society.
Yes.
They blame
Yes.
themselves for being stuck in abusive situations.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, when we talk about the problem lying with the abuser, and
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they don't want to change, where does the
Yeah.
solution to an abusive situation lie? Is that 100% in the hands of the victim? Is there ever a point at which the abuser plays a role in that? And if so, what role do they play?
The solution when you're in a abusive relationship is to recognize the abuse. But the thing is that physical, non-physical abuse, such as emotional and verbal abuse, they're very tricky. Unless you really understand the brainwashing, the mind mapping, the gaslighting, right? The darvo tactics, you don't really get it. And it's very convoluted. So I think the first thing is for the victim to recognize it. And then once you recognize it, and that's why I wrote my book and why we're having this conversation, is to run like hell.
Right. Yeah.
That's really the only solution, because as we know, we can't change or control anybody else.
It sounds like the idea is they may be able to change, but it's not your responsibility to stay and change.
Exactly. And people have to want to change. I mean, change is inevitable, right? But people have to want to change. And again, if they get if they're getting their needs met, why would they change? It works.
In culture rewards, like the
Yes.
reward. And that's what's so tricky about all of this is that when you look at the surface, I mean, Jordan is very charismatic and he is easy to listen to and entertain.
Mm-hmm.
And, so many of these people, it's funny because I grew up obviously in a fundamentalist Christian environment, which sounds worlds apart from Wolf of Wall Street. But when I watched it, I literally said, I was like, they could make a movie like this about megachurch pastors who literally crave all of these same things.
Yes.
Maybe
yes.
it's not as explicit, but you're right. Like to 99% of the population, they look motivated, driven, powerful, and impressive. to the 1% that sees them behind closed doors, they're seeing a totally different version. So
Correct.
I want to ask in regards to that, it's difficult enough to say to someone, hey, run like hell. It's even more difficult to say that when maybe their own family loves their husband or loves the person they're with, or the husband's family is saying, hey, he's a good guy. Really? Like you saw a couple bad things. That's not really him. Like,
Yeah.
how do you go about not only identifying abuse that you need to run away from, but also alerting other people around you who are still believing that you're the bad guy? Like you're leaving someone who is just misunderstood.
Yeah, well, that's the tricky part because these things are so layered, right? And usually the perpetrator, a pathological person, does not really demonstrate all of their horrible, abusive, controlling qualities to the public or to even their family. And it is super hard. And that's why I wrote my book, is because I have so much empathy for the victim. I know how hard it is and how nobody believes you. And people say you're enabling and you're codependent and that, and it's just such a hard situation. So that's why I think that therapy saved my life, because a good therapist will always connect you to your authenticity and really trusting more than your mind, trusting your body and your gut, that no matter how much I try to convince myself this isn't right, or how much others try to convince me, something is fundamentally wrong.
And when it comes to trusting yourself with all of these cases, when you first meet them, they seem great.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned in the book, like if a pathological lover, they present a stable personality when you first meet them. And
Yes,
that scares me in every context
I
because
know.
first impressions are everything, right?
Yes.
And you say trust yourself, trust beyond just your heart, but trust your instincts, trust your gut.
Yeah.
If someone is so good at putting up that facade and presenting a personality or a mask, how do you go about meeting anybody and trusting your first instincts about them?
I know. Well, here you bring up a great point. Here's the thing. Trust has to be earned, right? So I think I write about this, and that, especially for my own self, I just blindly trusted. I just gave my trust too willingly. And so trust has to be earned, first of all, and that takes time. And the mask does start to fall pretty quickly, especially if you know the signs, And so 6 months to a year in, it will start to fall because the person is who they are.
I used to always ask on the show, I used to ask people, what was the first red flag you noticed? And then I realized that's not practically helpful to people because the real story is, what is the first red flag you should have noticed? So for people who are listening, they're probably thinking, oh, did I blow past 60 red flags and I'm not noticing anything? What are some of the first things that people may notice when that mask starts to slip?
Well, some of the first things are someone who doesn't respect your boundaries. And that's a very nuanced experience, right? So if you try to say to somebody, like I did with my ex-husband, I really don't want to get married right now. He was like, if you don't want to marry me, we're not dating. I was like, oh God. Right. So that
That's the choice there.
right. So they're taking away your power. They're being super controlling. They're crossing your boundaries. If you see any substance abuse. So those are things that I would really look for, is crossing the boundaries, monopolizing all your time, trying to control you, not giving you the space to be you. And you slowly start to notice that over time.
Like losing yourself.
Losing yourself is the first symptom. Yes.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. And I think it applies even beyond relationships, but I think even in a corporate setting, like this question's about, are you in a cultish environment? Are you in a group that doesn't? And I think that losing your own identity and joining that collective identity of whether it's a couple
Yes.
or whether it's 2,000 people in
Yes.
an auditorium, that's a really good thing to look out for.
Yeah. You have to lose your identity to keep the couple's identity. And some other things is that what you'll find is that they blame you for everything and they lack empathy, right? So they victim signal a lot and they lack empathy when they hurt you. So boundaries, lacking empathy, victim signaling, you having to lose yourself. Those are the things you really need to watch for.
Can you explain victim signaling? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so victim signaling, this type of personality, it's actually a psychological term that's been researched. They will claim to be your victim, even though they will be the perpetrator, and they victim signal on purpose, like, oh, I can't believe that happened to me, or you really hurt my feelings, even though you're just sticking up for yourself because they cheated on you, right? But they do that to elicit your empathy, right? So they're doing it on purpose.
Yeah, they're preying on your best qualities.
Exactly. They're weaponizing your empathy, your kindness, your tolerance, your compassion. And you're just like, oh, maybe I did hurt them. Maybe it wasn't so bad what they did,
Sure.
right?
Right. And it's something too, like you mentioned in the book, like about predators kind of mapping out you, getting to know what you love, getting to know what you're interested in, getting to know your past traumas in a lot of these cases. I have to ask, like, this all sounds so strategic, and I've done enough stories and covered enough of these where like there's a formula to this, enough to write a book about.
Yes.
But my question always goes back to like, where do they learn these formulas? Is it literally just something that is just mimicked from seeing other behavior? Is it something that just your mind functions the same way? Like, why does it feel like there's a playbook passed out across religious backgrounds and business backgrounds and states and countries? Like, why does it feel like there's such a playbook to have this down to a science with how these guys operate?
Right. So let's think about it. So if we look at their behavior, we have to go behind the behavior and look at their motivation. All of their motivation is the same. They will use, exploit, lie, and betray anybody to get their needs met for power, pleasure, money, and status. They feel entitled to it, they feel superior, and they have no moral compass. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. That's pretty standard across all of these personalities or all these people. So because that's their modus operandi, right? These are really good ways to make that happen. And they've tried them enough to know, or they've seen them enough to know, and we're in a society that rewards those things over compassion, connection, emotions, humility.
Yeah, all those virtues. And it is, you can extrapolate it back to the American dream and the things that we view as success.
Yes.
And, I've seen this phenomenon over the past year or so even before that, I look at Jordan now, who still proudly is the Wolf of Wall Street. I look at people like Andrew Tate over the last several,
Oh, yeah.
the last 2 years, but especially the last year, this kind of, meteoric rise to prominence, teaching what is essentially a playbook on how to, at the expense of everybody else, achieve these grandiose visions for yourself.
Greed has been around since the beginning of time. I don't see it going away. I grew up in the era where, Michael Douglas on Wall Street actually told us greed is good, right? So that 80s and 90s time was really a time where that was pumped down our throats. And so I think having these conversations where there are other things that are good, that are intangibles too, and so I don't know that we can change that, but I think we can shift the conversation, and we can also shift what we value.
I think that's great. The shifting of values is huge, because it is something when it goes to like what you want most, and that's what you're pursuing. It's like rethinking what you want most,
Right.
Do you want to have a sweet house and a wife that hates you because you're a total jerk,
Right.
or do you want kids that don't want to talk to you, but you've got a Fortune 500 company,
That's
like
right.
those are all
That's right.
alignments of values.
Yes. And remember, if you don't have a moral compass, it's very hard to have healthy values.
Yeah, that probably hurts.
If you think about Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, the Boy Scout leaders, we're seeing this in very extreme ways.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to talk a little bit about like the process of leaving, because obviously your book's titled "Run Like Hell." These guys with if you're with somebody with no moral compass and who is exhibiting all these traits, running like hell is probably a great option. But
Yes, yes, yes,
you know,
yes.
like I said, it's easier said than done. Would you mind, if you're open to it, kind of sharing when you realized you needed to run personally and what
Sure.
that experience was like? And then on the flip side of that, what would your advice be to someone who is about to go through that, is considering doing that? Like, what mistakes could they avoid that would make it a less dangerous or less, no matter what, it's going to be difficult, but a less
Yes.
damaging
Yeah.
experience for them?
I think all along I was feeling trapped and unsafe and insecure and used and just not seen. Right. I think, but then I had a child and another child. And like you say, families are involved and money's involved. And, and I was in therapy, but we all have a last straw moment. And my last straw moment was when and I talk about this, in a lot of my TikToks or videos, when I told my ex-husband, you have to get sober because I don't want to sit here and watch you kill yourself. And he threw my clothing and jewelry and lit them on fire and got violent with me and drove my daughter into the garage door. And he did get sober, which was the great news. So, but I could never come back from that moment. But I didn't really feel safe enough to leave because he was very powerful, had a lot of money. And I always say I was kind of lucky in that he got arrested because he got arrested. He had an ankle bracelet, and I then felt safe enough to leave because I was like, okay, now the world sees that he's a criminal. He's been an emotional criminal with me, right? But the world sees it now. So there was that validation. And then I left. And so people say, oh, you left him because he lost his money. No, no, no. No, and I want to be very clear about that. It was because I felt safe enough. And I know some women, they don't ever get that moment where they can feel safe enough. And a lot of times they just feel so unsafe, or the abuse has just been so much, something inside of them just says no more.
And do you think there's also like a sunk cost fallacy where, we already have kids, we've already bought a house together, we've already done this? Like, do you think that's a motivating factor a lot of times as well? Like, I'm already
Sure.
in this deep in this relationship. Like, how do I
Sure.
reset?
Yeah. And financial dependency is real. And having children with someone is real. Let's say also if you have some sort of physical illness and you're not your best self, or let's say you're older and you don't feel like you have the strength. I mean, I think there are a lot of very real life components that make it very hard to leave. And yet you can still.
If someone's listening, they're in a situation like this and they're thinking, how do I do this safely? Or how do I do this in a way that, doesn't lead to either physical harm or being,
Yeah.
abused even further? How do you safely exit a situation like this? Like, what are some of the biggest, like,
Yeah. Yeah. My number one thing is never let them see you coming. Because you're at the end, in a trauma bond, at the bottom of it is about control. All abuse is about control. And so you don't want them to know that they're going to lose control over you because it's just going to incite them and ignite them. And the last thing you need as you're trying to plan your escape is this pathological person upping the ante on their crazy behavior. So you have to be just as strategic as they were in manipulating you. And it's hard for the women I work with. I feel guilty. I'm doing this behind their back. I don't know if I can do this. And I'm like, well, you have to do it to stay safe because you have to plan financially. Don't ever tell them when they're on drugs like I did, which was a big mistake, right? So the number one thing is get a therapist. If you're going to get divorced, get a good lawyer that's an expert in leaving a pathological person, not just a regular divorce coach. Get highly educated and don't let them see you coming and really plan for it.
What about with kids? And again, if you're open to discussing that,
Yeah.
I'm curious, how do you go about even explaining that? Because I have to imagine too, this is not uncommon in any family situation, but kids have a different interaction with their mom or their dad
Sure.
than the mom and dad have with each other at times.
Sure.
So the dad could be the hero and they always do amazing birthday gifts, and they always do this. But man, mom's really mean to him. Like how do you go about
Yeah.
having those conversations and explaining to them
Yeah.
without also doing damage to them by making them rethink their entire childhood and their own parents? Like, how do you go about navigating that process with children?
Yeah, which is it's a very tricky process. My piece of advice there is, even though you might dislike your ex, don't disparage them.
Hmm.
That doesn't do the child any good. Now, you can be factual with them in an age developmentally appropriate way about what happened, but it doesn't do you any good to disparage your ex. Get your negative feelings out towards them with your friends, with your family, with your therapist, but just continually talking poorly about them isn't fair to the child or the children.
Yeah, I like
And
that
that's what,
speaking factual. I like that advice
yeah,
versus,
it-
saying he did some things that were not right versus just
right,
going, your dad's full.
right,
It's not
right,
productive.
right. And I have to say, Jordan and I, we've always done a very good job with our children, and our children are great. And that's why when the movie came out, they weren't freaked out because we had already processed it ad nauseum. They weren't like, oh my God. They were like, oh yeah, that's my dad. He's extreme.
Yeah.
He's over the top. So, but that's my piece of advice, because they'll show who they are over time anyway. And it's your child's job as they get older to figure out the type of relationship that they want to have with them. Unless they're super, super young and you have to protect them and there's physical violence. I mean, that's a separate issue, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. When you get into like physical or sexual violence, it's a totally
Yeah,
different conversation.
that's totally
Um,
different.
yeah. And that's good to clarify, like specifically when it gets to emotional, and that can be such a subjective thing on the outside where, again,
Yes.
they have to see it for themselves. I think
Yep. And my children have been in therapy since they're 16, 15 years old. My daughter's a therapist,
oh,
friends and
wow.
family. Yeah. So yeah. So we've always been very interested in our emotional life
Yeah.
and our relationships because they take work and effort.
Yeah, they definitely do. Definitely do. Well, I'm curious about this. One of the things you said in your book was you're talking about how people deal with situations like this. And you mentioned a statement very early on that shocked me. And you said females tend to be more emotional than men. And I instantly flashed in my mind to scenes from films like Wolf of Wall Street or stories like that. And I think
Yeah.
if anyone looks emotionally unhinged, it is a lot of the abusive men that I've covered on this show.
Yes.
I'm curious, do you think that is there some kind of research on that as far as like what that means as far as how emotions are processed? Do you think it's just more noticeable when women have an outburst of anger or frustration in these situations because culture so vilifies those expressions of emotion? I was just curious in
Mhm.
the context of the quote from a person from
Yeah. I think that women value their emotional internal life more than men. So they do feel more comfortable expressing the more vulnerable emotions like sadness or despair or longing or, real hurt and around betrayal and stuff like that. And I think in society, we don't really value emotional expression. So I do think women do get vilified for expressing those emotions. And I think, yes, those men for sure express something that I call humiliated fury, which is a mix of entitlement, rage, and shame. And we don't judge men as much for having extreme expressions of anger.
Yeah.
Like for them, almost anger is like okay for them to express. They
That
can't
is the
express,
personality. Yeah.
yeah, they can't express the more vulnerable ones. So I just think in general, women are more at peace with their emotions.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. I love that explanation because it was something that took me off guard because I was like, what does this mean? How are we approaching this? And Yeah, it sounds like even in that answer, it sounds like there's a lot of cultural impact on that. I think
Of course.
it's one of the things. I mean, I know growing up, like one of the conversations a lot of times with leadership in our church environment was, Eric is so emotional. Eric's too emotional. But
Got
then on
it.
the flip side, you're seeing pastors get in the pulpit and scream for an hour about a topic. And you're like, that
Right.
seems very emotional. It just seems
Yes.
like a
Yes.
more acceptable form of emotion.
Yes. In their eyes.
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a culturally larger conversation. Like men are supposed to be more stoic. Like there's a lot of just age old
Sure.
stereotypes that I think put people
Sure.
in these odd boxes. But in addition to that, like there's a lot of reactions and emotions associated with being in these relationships.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times, there can be judgment towards someone who is frustrated being in a situation with an abusive individual, or if people can
Yeah.
say, hey, you're not feeling the right way about it. You're not reacting the right way about it. You're not expressing or handling the situation the way I would handle it. One statement that I quote all the time from Viktor Frankl is the idea that there's no abnormal reaction to abnormal situations. Um,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
agree with that statement? Do you think
Yes.
I know you can pathologize a little bit and here's some things that people experience, but do you feel like there's really a set, hey, everybody reacts one of these few ways, or is it always its own unique situation?
I think after you've been intimidated, dominated, threatened, and controlled and abused,
You might be angry.
yeah, you might have something, you might have a reaction, right? And so I actually did a video about this the other day. Like, if you were on the street and a stranger came up to you and started to attack you and curse you out and you reacted, would somebody say that's abuse? Mutual abuse? They wouldn't. I mean, I remember, I've never spoken about this, but when Jordan was pressuring me, and I have to laugh at myself and I have to own this, to have children. And he was pressuring me and pressuring and pressuring me. And I'm so glad I have my children. I have no regrets. I think I literally took a glass Tropicana juice jar and threw it at his head from across the living room. Okay. I am not a violent person. I was 23 at the time, so I have to give my 23-year-old some grace. And I wouldn't do that today as a more emotionally regulated, mature woman. But yeah, I just couldn't take it anymore.
Was that a constant? Was it constant? I want this now. Here's this. Is
Yes,
that
it was constantly like that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think having children was like a big life topic, right? It wasn't just like, I want to go to this restaurant, you know.
yeah.
And yeah, I had my own reaction to it.
For him, it seems like he was kind of writing the book of his own life and he needed characters to play parts where it's like,
Yes.
now I need to
Yes.
check off having the kids and now I need to have the, you know, this thing and this thing. And that's a lot of pressure to be under, to be the one
Yeah.
that has to fulfill all of those things.
And hence you lose yourself as it didn't matter what I wanted. I was only going to be the ones carrying the babies, having the babies, caring for the babies. You know, my needs were of no consequence.
Yeah. So like you said, that emotional outburst is going to happen at some point.
Yes.
Um, this is a good place, I think, to kind of outline. You mentioned Darvo in the book. I think people
Yeah.
who listen may be familiar with this, but a lot of this really, I mean, you can see this play out in so many relationships. I thought it would be a good way to kind of explain it. I don't think I've broken it down on the show. I think in
Okay.
different posts we've talked about it. It's come
Yeah.
up. We just haven't used the phrase, but I think it's one people should get familiar with.
Yes.
So when you get in a situation where you confront an abuser,
Hmm.
Darvo can be employed by them. Let's talk a little bit about what that is.
Yeah. So DARVO stands for deny, attack, and then reverse the victim and offender. And so at first, what happens is the pathological person will deny it. They'll say something like, I don't remember that happening. That never happened. Right. But then they'll attack your credibility or attack you. Like, no one would believe you anyway if you said anything about that. You actually provoked me. You made me do that. And then they reverse it. even though you're the one that's been suffering, at their hands, let's just say, they'll just become the victim again, right? So it employs the victim signaling again, like, I'm actually the one that's suffering the most. You did this to me. And so I say it's like gaslighting on steroids. So it's deny that never happened, attack, you're actually the one that did it, and I'm actually the one that's suffering. And so that gets played out repeatedly throughout the relationship and really is a very strong mind game. And people really use it after separation too.
I never pressed you to have kids. You're actually the one that lost your temper and threw a glass.
Yeah. Look how crazy you are. Get it together. Look, I'm unsafe here.
Always doing this. Yeah.
Right. And I just read a really interesting article that I had never read before, and I love learning all the time, as you can tell. How defamation is darvo.
I've never thought about that, but yeah, it very much is.
You could think about that like, I never did that to you. You're making that up, and now you have to pay the consequences. Right. And I had never thought about that. I had just read it, and I was like, "Oh God,
wow, that is really interesting." That's something. Wow, I'm going to be thinking about a lot of different situations in that context, because that very much. So we just did a documentary series on clergy abuse, and it's very interesting because a pastor got up in the pulpit and started trying to discredit some of the survivors that were featured, even though they've won lawsuits and have put abusers behind bars. He's still very much going, I didn't know anything happened. These women are crying big crocodile tears and trying to get a payout. And they're just trying to broad brush all churches like us. So you literally have deny, attack, reverse offender, and victim in that statement. He's literally defaming these women who've come forward, where there's on the books, they've been proven to be correct.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Jennifer Freyd is the one who came up with the term darvo, Freyd. So you can look it up. Yeah. She's written a lot of really interesting articles about it.
That's fascinating. I'm gonna have to go back through some clips and start posting some examples with that framework.
Good.
It's really interesting.
Good.
I'm curious too, like we're kind of touching on systems and like the individual, attacking somebody. It typically in these cases with male abusers, and I know you say in your book, and I want to clarify for people listening, this can happen in reverse order. There can be female abusers.
Of course.
But obviously you're writing from your own experience, from your clients, which are largely female. Like,
yes.
So we're not discounting those experiences.
Not at all. Not at all.
Coming into the male side and focusing in on that, I am curious, like, yes, there's the individual, but also there are systems that enable, right? Whether it's the boys club at the office, whether it's a patriarchal system within a religious denomination. You mentioned patriarchy for a little bit within your book.
Yes.
And strict adherence to those structures is very prevalent in the group that my listeners would be familiar with. How do you see like those rigid patriarchal beliefs affecting women who are trapped in these relationships? Because oftentimes they're not allowed to have jobs. They're barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen. There is those cliches that are enforced by their leaders, their parents. Like, how do you even navigate that mess, and how does it affect them in those situations?
I try to do this very simply with patriarchy because it's such a hot button, but patriarchy is basically a hierarchy, right? One person's above and has the power, and one person is below, right? And that's what a trauma bond is about. It has to include a power imbalance, or else it doesn't exist. So in the patriarchy, one person has the power, one person doesn't. And what I think of feminism as, and Terry Real, the great relationship expert, talks about this, is just everybody being able to be in their own power, which is simply the ability to influence yourself and be connected. So we want to look for relationships like that, where there's more of a collaborative, equal connection.
With that in mind, for someone who's leaving that type of system, leaving that type of relationship, the idea of dating again, finding love,
Yes.
true love at that
I
point
know.
is a very scary thing. It looks like from your social media, you're in a very healthy and happy relationship
Yes. Yes.
with
Yes.
someone who seems very different than perhaps past experiences. So I'm
Yeah.
curious for you, how did you develop enough trust in yourself to pursue another relationship?
Yeah.
And how did you go about feeling comfortable with that level of commitment, even after having the ultimate betrayal of one gone wrong?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, I think I was young. I was 31, so I was still naive and hopeful. So I think that adds to it. And yeah, it was very, very hard to trust again, extraordinarily hard. And I empathize with people who were in that process. But it was also really learning to trust myself and, of course, to take a leap of faith. But there were certain green flags. And the first argument that I had with my husband, my current husband of 24 years, or disagreement, and he was like, "Yeah, I hear you." And I was like, "What?" I mean, you would have thought he said to me, "I'm going to take you to Mars on a spaceship and you're going to be the queen of Mars." Like, it was so out of my box of ordinary after my past marriage. And he was able to have empathy. I could have needs in the relationship. I could actually get taken care of. And I'll never forget, my therapist said to me when I was married to Jordan, because I love to cook and I'm a caretaker, I love to entertain. She was like, one day you're going to find somebody who's going to cook for you. I was like, get the hell out of here. I found somebody who made me pizza every night. I mean, every Friday night, who bring me my coffee in the morning, who it was more reciprocity with the caretaking. So there are green flags too.
That's really cool. And I think that's really beautiful for people to hear that there is something. Because I know, regardless of the context, when people come out of a difficult situation, it can be extremely hard to feel. It can
Sure.
feel like that's game over. And especially, I
Yeah.
think you mentioned, yeah, you're young and hopeful, but I also think when you're young, there's a level of feeling older than you are.
Yes, for sure.
And
For
so, I
sure.
mean, I'm 28 and I find myself contemplating, like, man, when I pass away, or when I do this, and then I start thinking, I'm like, got like 40, 50 years before I even need to be thinking about that. But it's that
Yeah.
level of like, I'm trying to grow up, but also
Yeah.
I'm hopeful for the future. And I think for a lot of times, people like myself in my 20s, it's hard when a business thing goes wrong, when a relationship goes wrong,
Sure.
to not
Sure.
go, oh, this is the end of my life. This is the end of
I
my,
know.
and I can't imagine being in a situation like, you know, so many people probably resonate with that you've shared. It's got to really feel like that. Like, oh, this was my happily ever after, and now it's not. What do I do?
Yeah.
So I
And
love that there's,
I want to just say two things about that. I think, first of all, as a therapist, I work with all my patients that rejection, failure, heartache, mistakes, they're all inevitable.
hmm,
It just means you're trying, kind of like to reframe that. And I think if you do have a dream of this happily ever after and it does fail, to really allow yourself the space to grieve for what you thought could be. And by the way, I want to say you're only 28. You're succeeding.
oh, well, thank you. That's good to know. Um, no, it's really cool. I love that reframe, and it's that idea of like, I'm moving forward. So there's going to be obstacles,
Yeah.
there's going to be things that happen. And you mentioned space to grieve. This is something too that I think can be difficult, is you could sit there and it's the old example of the guy that wanted to play in the NFL and had an injury in high school, and he's 40 years old saying, I would have been big in the NFL, but I injured myself in high school. Like,
Yeah.
how do you go about grieving in a way that isn't a hindrance to future development? Like, where it doesn't
Yeah.
become your identity, but you
Yeah.
also are not saying, I'm going to put that all in a box, because that's not healthy. As a therapist,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
don't hide that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you have to give yourself the space for the grief because it's real. And we can't, and I think inside we talked about this, we're so afraid of our emotions, but you have to give yourself the space to grieve. And look at me, I'm a total late bloomer. I'm 56. right? I didn't go back to school till I was 39 to be a therapist, got my doctorate at 45. You know, there's hope.
Yeah. There's hope and there's time.
Yeah.
I know we're near the end of our time here. I want to just ask two practical questions. One,
Yes.
I want to talk about somatic mindfulness. I know that's a topic that could be a
Yes.
podcast of its own, but
Yes.
this is a term that I just interviewed someone recently. We discussed a little bit, but just kind of your perspective on it. And then the part two of that question would just be for someone who has never gone to therapy, is considering therapy. I know, again, in our context we were raised in, therapy was preached against. It was not viewed as a viable option, but I know it can be a very
Okay.
helpful thing. How
Yeah.
does someone go about finding a good therapist that they can
Therapists,
truly?
yes, which is tricky. Yeah. So somatic mindfulness is very simple. It's really, we get so caught up in our thoughts. And I always say the ego really lives more in the thoughts or our defenses. But somatic mindfulness is simply paying attention to your sensations because that's where the emotions and the authentic self lives, and getting connected to them and tracking, grief and sadness in the throat, shame in the chest, anxiety in the belly, and learning to really connect to your body so you can connect to your emotional self. And then the second question is, yes, it's hard to find a good therapist. And I acknowledge that. And yet the research shows that more than what the therapist studies, it's the relationship between the patient and the therapist. So I would, first of all, take recommendations from friends. I would specifically, if you're in this sort of cult-like or trauma bond situation or getting out of it, find a therapist that's very well versed in that. And even if they're not, and you connect with them, willing to be very open to learn about it. And if you've experienced a lot of trauma, which if you've been in a cult or a religious cult or a trauma bond, find a therapist also that maybe can do EMDR, because that can really help, right? And it's important to search for someone and take your time. You can now go to 2 or 3 therapists. You can interview them. That's happened to me numerous times. It's okay. But you will find somebody. There's a pot. There's a cover for every pot.
I've become friends with a couple of therapists, and I'm always love hearing that answer. And I love when they say, try a couple. Like, don't just
Yeah.
first one you find in the, everyone uses the yellow pages. First one you find in the yellow pages and go, oh, this is my one that I'm going to use. The other answer that one of my friends says, she's a trauma therapist. And she said, the first question to ask every therapist is, are you in therapy?
That's right.
They say no, don't go.
That's a great advice. I love that.
Listen, I really appreciate you joining me on this episode. And I know your book is going to be very helpful to my audience. Before we close out, is there anything that, I know writing a book is a big task. Is there anything that was on your mind or on your heart the whole time you were writing it that didn't get communicated in this episode that you hope people would take away when they put down this book?
No, this has been a lovely, lovely conversation. And we touched on a lot of things. And, I wrote my book for women everywhere. And it was a very, very hard task. And I just wrote it for them.
Well, if you're listening, be sure to grab a copy of Run Like Hell. I've read through it. It's an amazing read. I think it'll be very helpful and relatable to many people who are listening to this episode. But for now, thank you so much for joining me on the show, and I'll see you in future episodes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eric. Take care.